communists. The campaign featured notable members of the Politburo Standing Committee, such as the first amongst equals, Sean Egan of the SWSS AAPPP, and the members of Young Sinn Féin advocating for peace in the Middle East. Thankfully, we're sure the campaign is in safe hands with those famed advocates of peaceful conflict resolution, Sinn Féin, taking over. Trinity News reports that the Knesset had an emergency meeting yesterday and that Benjamin Netanyahu is quaking in his capitalist manufacturing boots. The provost also weighed in, saying that it was deplorable that Trinity students had their speeches curtailed, and that we're welcome to any foreign students once they pay fees. On the bright side, we get tickets for Ambassadors Ball are flying out of the blockaded door. There'll be enough for the business of media adjourned.
Oh yeah, there are questions to my side of these minutes as true and accurate reflection of the last private business meeting. They're being known, I should maybe just like, yeah, space.
Great. Hi everyone, and welcome to The Hiss. This is private business where we run through the internal workings of the society. And after a few minutes, we'll be back downstairs with our guests to start the debate properly. So this is all pretty quick. So, Mr. Treasurer, for the first time, are there any fines?
There are no fines.
Madam Librarian? Mr. Record Secretary, are there any reports to be read?
There are no reports to be read.
Are there any motions on notice?
There are no motions on notice.
Are there any motions not on
There are no
notice?
motions on notice.
This brings us to general business. Is there any general business? Yes, I have some general business.
Oh, general business.
So I'd like to propose a privilege motion number 3, a motion of solidarity with the administrative staff of Trinity College, who are currently going through some difficulties with Trinity College and are considering industrial action within the coming weeks. Proposed, Ron McGillivray.
Seconded, Dermot Down for SMC.
Great. Is there any other general business?
Steve's still
Okay. Fair. Yeah, then there's no other general business. For the second time, Mr. Treasurer, are there any fines?
There are no fines.
Sorry? Oh, yeah. Well, no. And yeah, Madam Librarian. Yeah, great. Okay. So yeah, we're just going to head back upstairs now and come back down for the guests and stuff. So I'll hand it over to the chair to adjourn.
Call this meeting adjourned. Oh, very much.
I call upon Dr. Evelyn Mahon to take the chair.
Call this House to order and call upon the Record Secretary to read the minutes of the last public business meeting.
The last public business meeting of the College Historical Society took place on Wednesday, the 15th of February, with Meg Beer and Alex Pugh in the chair. Last week saw the freshers take over. We're only too aware that the 247 years of the College Historical Society's existence is a valuable and esteemed institution within Ireland for its outstanding contribution to discourse over the years. We produced many members of our society like Edmund Burke, Wolfe Tone, Mary Harney, Mr. Justice Theodore King of War, and Conor Cruise O'Brien. This tradition, however, came to an abrupt and grinding halt last week, when the freshers voted on the intellectually challenging motion of "This House would ban memes." We're sure that the society is in safe hands. And for the future of our institutions, we sincerely hope they grow up. Freshers James Johnson and Luke Fahey took great pleasure in methodologically consulting every member of our committee and society as a whole, proving that their nanoscience degree will be valuable when they continue overcompensating in the future. We also saw vital contributions to discourse, like Jack Kennedy is a lad from Monicari, also Kevin Smith is a bit on the Tinder, which is wrong. And also, as noted from the Student Day Choir, the freshers are a bit dull this year, aren't they? There'll be enough for the business meeting adjourned.
Are there any objections to my signing these minutes as a true and accurate account of the last public business meeting?
Objection.
Okay. Then I shall duly sign. I would now like to call upon the auditor to introduce the invited guests.
So our chair for this evening is Dr. Evelyn Mahon, who's a Fellow Emeritus of the School of Social Work and Social Policy here in Trinity. Her early research interests and publications were in women's movements, gender equity in the workplace, and feminist theory. Dr. Mahon contributed to the Government Commission on Assisted Human Reproduction. And then our proposition guest is Carol Tureen, who is a board member of the Sex Workers Alliance of Ireland and is a history and philosophy graduate from Trinity. And she's been active in the LGBT rights campaign since 2011, first for marriage equality and later for gender recognition. And Carol is particularly interested in the political and legislative aspects of LGBTQ issues, as well as historically marginalised sections of the queer community, such as trans and non-binary issues, intersex people, and sex work. So just then, a reminder about standing orders this evening. So standing orders that speeches will be 7 minutes in length. There'll be a bang at the first, well, a bell actually at the first minute and last minute of the speech. So the first and last minute are protected time, so no one from the floor can offer any questions. But during the middle few minutes, anyone from the floor, so that's all of you guys, can stand up and say something along the lines of a point of information or on that point. And if the speaker chooses to accept you, then you can ask them a question. Please keep those to about 15 seconds or less. If they reject you, they can just kind of wave you down. Please do just sit down and wait about 15 seconds before asking another question. Then finally, just point you to the oratory returns, which you'll find on your seats. There's detailed instructions inside for how you should fill those out. Critiquing our speakers, so it's another chance for you guys to get involved. We use these at the end of the year to calculate medals and prizes for the best speakers in the chamber of the year. So please do fill those out, as they do matter a lot to our speakers. So without further ado then, I'd like to hand you back over to the chair to start the debate.
The question before the House this evening is, this House believes your body is yours to sell. And I would now like to call upon Hannah Sophia Cogan to propose the motion to the House.
Anna, just before we begin, as this is your first time speaking in the chamber, you're entitled to maiden rights, so that means if you choose to accept them, no one from the floor can offer you a point of information, but if you choose to waive them, we'll give you a rousing round of applause. Which do you choose?
Waive them. In a liberal democracy, it is accepted that to a large extent, people should have the right to control what happens to their bodies and that they are entitled to a considerable amount of ownership over them. That as long as you are not harming somebody else, you should be allowed to do what you want is the core value of liberalism. Now, within most of these societies, the right to bodily autonomy becomes redundant after death. When you die, you essentially become the property of your closest relative. Note the concept of ownership is still inherent here. I decided to take this motion quite literally. I'm going to talk about selling organs, and for the purposes of this debate, I am talking about organs that can be very safely removed without any serious risk of complication, for example, kidneys. Okay. My first point of substantive will show you that if we legalise the selling of organs, we will no longer have to bear witness to people dying, not because they were incurable, but because the health system failed them and they were not given the organ that could have saved them. Because there weren't enough to go around. We will no longer have to ask people to gracefully accept death when death can be avoided. The reason we don't currently have enough organs is that people are not driven by altruism. Uncompensated donations won't solve the problem. If they did, we wouldn't have a shortage in the first place. Despite decades of public awareness campaigns, the waiting list only gets longer. What does drive us is profit and incentive. We don't tend to want to give something if we're not getting something back. The prospect of making money, or at least receiving some form of generous compensation, will make people much more likely to donate organs. No, thank you. And if our bodies are ours to manage, then logically we should be allowed to sell our organs. It's people's right to assume the risk of doing something that carries more danger than most activities if they think that the result will be worthwhile. This is why we are okay with people driving race cars or working in coal mines or even joining the army. This feeds into my second point of substantive, that legalising the sale of organs is not discriminating against the poor. Yes, it probably is more likely that poorer people are more likely to take advantage of the opportunity to sell organs. But if somebody sees selling an organ as a legitimate way of helping themselves out of financial hardship, then it's patronising to forbid them from doing so, particularly given that they can live a long and healthy life without it. My third point is that in a world in which people already buy and sell organs, we might as well make it as safe as possible. The illegal organ trade is a reality. Desperate people sell their organs on the black market in countries like Pakistan and China. It's an extremely dangerous thing to do. It's in no way guaranteed that you'll get a qualified physician carrying out your operation, and complications are common due to poor sanitation and incorrect medical practice. It's also very dangerous for the organ recipients because the person whose organ you are getting has not been vetted or checked for diseases. You could very easily find yourself a great deal sicker than you were before. Does it not make sense to legalise this trade? It's going to happen anyway, but if it's legal, we can regulate it and ensure that both donors and recipients will be cared for by qualified medical practitioners. But when we commodify organs, we don't necessarily put a direct price on them. For example, organs could be given to the government in exchange for your free health insurance or free aftercare. We see a system like this in Iran, which has almost entirely eliminated transplant waiting lists. and sorry, I can't read that word. Oh, and recipients, sorry, my handwriting is awful, and recipients do not necessarily have to pay for organs with money. Those who can afford them directly could make up the cost by doing instalments of government work over a period of time, for example. My last point is that a legitimate regulated organ market is better than a presumed consent system, which, given the severe shortage, is the only viable alternative. Under a presumed consent system, you forfeit your body to the state upon death. If you are killed in a car crash, for example, but your heart is still in good shape, it might be taken out of you and given to someone else, and nobody gets a say in the matter. This might look fine if it means that fewer people die on waiting lists, and maybe we should be willing to forfeit some amount of bodily autonomy if it means this happens. But when the premise is analysed more deeply, we see that it is far more nuanced and problematic than this. In countries like France and Brazil, attempts to bring in presumed consent systems has led to a decrease in live donations because people don't like the idea of the state having the power to do what it wants with their dead bodies. On a more philosophical level, I argue that if we allow the state to decide that organs can be taken from your body without your permission, even if you are dead when it happens, that this means the state is also allowed to assume your values and wishes. It is given the authority to determine what happens to you in your body. It's a very macabre form of eminent domain. So I'm on 5 minutes. If there's a POI, I'll take one. If there isn't, I will wrap it up. Sure.
I think that given the fact that voluntarily offering your organs will shorten your life expectancy, it's better value for money just to get organs through a program.
I specifically said in my introduction that I was speaking only about organs such as kidneys or perhaps corneas, which can be really, really safely removed. There are no long-term health repercussions. If there are, it's only in extremely rare situations. It's not going to impact your life in any significant way beyond the recovery period. So I don't see how that POI stands. Okay, well, that's me. Thank you very much.
Now I would like to call on Maeve Nipur to oppose the motion.
Maeve, as this is also your first time speaking in the chamber, you are also entitled to maiden's rights, so should you choose to accept them, no one from the floor can offer you a point of information, but should you choose to waive them, you'll get a rousing round of applause. Which do you choose?
I'd like to waive them.
Okay, today, ladies and gentlemen, I think I'm going to presume that we're going to hear a lot about feminism and equality activism, and that it is a woman's right, or anybody's right, really, to sell their body if they so choose. However, that's not what feminism is about, at least not for the most part. It's about defeating sexism all over the planet for all types of people. And feminists have a very bad reputation already of being middle-class women who leave out minority and impoverished women, especially when it doesn't suit their agenda. As feminists, we must ensure that women are included when we talk about what a feminist stance on an issue is. Secondly, what I'd like to press upon you all tonight is that our actions as relatively rich and wealthy people in the first world will have dire consequences on those who do not enjoy the privilege of being able to decide whether or not to sell their body. I'll speak primarily tonight about selling organs and the practice of being a surrogate mother, and how these practices will have very negative implications on those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, while only benefiting those from upper classes. So the motion tonight applies in consent. This house believes that your body is yours to sell if you so choose. But what I'm about to argue is that there's only a few people who really have that choice. Because if you have to choose between selling a kidney or letting your children go hungry, there is no real choice. When the men in your village are telling you that you can make a lot of money from being a surrogate mother for just 9 months, and you don't know that they won't cover any post-delivery complications, and you're not sure about the health benefits or risks, you're not making a real choice because you are not well informed. And it is not patronizing to say that those who are desperate will not be taken advantage of. They will be. We see it all the time. It's not patronizing to say that these things should be illegal. And even if you said that the problems could be alleviated by regulation in these countries, as the first speaker said, I ask you to think of child labor, of the appalling and horrendous conditions people are made to work in sweatshops. Regulation has not stopped these atrocities, and they've become more and more common due to Western demand for cheap goods. And the only way to curb Western demand is not to permit the selling of the body in the first place. I'll take your point.
Yeah, so child labour happens because we don't have enough regulation.
I would argue that's not the case. There's a amount and loads and more regulation happening in the third world. It's just not working. Because the fact is, when these places are in rural areas that don't have a lot of policing available or not that much to cover a large amount of area, this happens, especially when it happens at nighttime. There's a lot of ways of going around regulation. It still occurs, guys. There is a lot of regulation, but still happening. The same would happen of the abuse of people who have no other choice but to sell their organs. And currently, it is illegal in most Western countries to buy or sell organs. And as a result, yes, we do rely on donations, of which there is hardly enough compared to how much we need, and there is a very long waiting period, of which people do definitely die. However, the answer does not lie in allowing people to fill up this demand by supplying their own organs for profit. It would in fact make the process of waiting for an organ transplant even more unfair. This is because the price of an organ would be so high that only the richest in our society would be able to afford it, while the poorest of our society would never get a chance.
On that point.
No, they are worse off than before, because at least before you only had to wait as long as everyone else. Your socioeconomic positioning in our society did not count. But now, this is not the case. You do not have enough money. And to add insult to injury, the poorest of our society would only be the ones that are forced into selling their organs, because they're the only ones that are desperate enough for cash, and because now it would be a legitimate and accepted way of making money. The irony is that the loss of an organ can lead to health issues that prevent you from working or force you to buy an expensive medicine, effectively negating any you received. The first speaker spoke about how we're only talking about really safe procedures, but what I've already explained to you is that when it becomes legal, it forces those who are the poorest to take on the worst type of operations. So you might have middle-class people giving up kidneys, but you will have horrible people living in horrible conditions who, to alleviate their position, will sell off more important organs. And so in this system, the rich will be the only ones who do not have to wait for an organ transplant, while never having to be in a position of being forced to sell theirs, while the poorest will never be able to afford one and will be pressured by the market to risk their health for much needed funds. And by the way, donations will now be few and far between, much worse than they currently are, because why donate an organ when you can get a profit from it, or your family can? Unlike the first speaker, I think there's a much better way to deal with shortage of organs in the free market. And the way to do it is like the French have, an automatic donor status on all people so they can opt out of, just like in France. And this, perhaps at the moment, there would be perhaps a time where people would have less organs in the short term, but in the long term, you have the supply that you need. And this way you don't have the exploitation of the less fortunate, in a system in which everyone has an equal chance of receiving an organ if they need them, regardless of their socioeconomic backgrounds. The other problem with promoting an ability to sell one's body is that side actors would capitalize on this new gap in the market. Unlike what you see in India, where women are convinced into spending months in appalling conditions while carrying other people's children. Once your body is a commodity that can be sold or rented out, there will be a push to cut costs, to make the process as cheap as possible to get the most profitable return. And these profits rarely go back to the surrogate mothers. They are often cheated out of their fair share by the third parties, who are unable to access this legal system to ensure that they're treated fairly.
Why does anything this different in signing a contract for a mine where I have to hit rocks and sticks for 5 or 9 hours every day?
I'm saying it is an awful thing. I've already explained that the exploitation of the poor in third world countries is absolutely appalling. What I'm saying is that there should not be new legislation in the first world that pushes more of that burden onto the poor people. Because here's the thing, we already know that the rich will push the poor that they don't want to do on those who don't have any option to say no. They don't have the privilege of saying, no, I'd actually rather not. They have to take what money they have. I'm saying this is appalling already, but I'm saying that any legislation that allows this to happen in any capacity is absolutely wrong and appalling. And so as you can see, if we're really being feminists tonight, I'm going to go back a moment. Even worse, this is my main point, we'll see a hike in the amount of women being trafficked, sold, used without their consent. Because here's the thing, how do you know if this woman is given consent? And the same problem is seen in prostitution. How do you know for sure that this woman is given consent a lot of the times? And we'll see this hike and how women are treated unfairly. This is awful. So as you can see, if we're not really being feminists tonight, or if we are being feminist tonight even, we have to accept that the ability to sell one's body ultimately hurt women the most. Despite any sexual liberation that the proposition argue happens, we need to accept that our actions affect more than ourselves in such a globalized world. And like I said before, where the work rich don't want to do get pushed onto those who don't have the privilege of being able to say no to making money. Because of these reasons, I urge you to oppose the motion.
I would like to call on our guest speaker, Carol Perron.
Thank you very much, Chair, members of the committee, members of the society. Thank you very much for the internet stalking that went into my profile that was read out earlier. I didn't email that to anyone, so someone did some very good research on it. And just for a point of information, people, I prefer gender-neutral pronouns. Sorry, I didn't clarify that with the committee earlier on, so they, them, there. Just want to respond to a few points made by the last speaker. In relation to the harms that supporting this kind of motion would do, particularly for people in the third world, or for the global south rather. I can't speak about organ sale, I don't know that much about it, but in relation to sex work, I can say that the most active and well-organised sex worker rights movements are in the global south, particularly in India and Thailand. The idea that, for sex work at least, that women in the global south are particularly incapable of making choices or particularly lacking agency is not the case for sex work at least. I wanted to speak particularly about the Sexual Offences Bill that was recently passed, and we've read about this in the news recently. Part 4 of the bill is, according to the government and according to the media, designed to help sex workers and help people exit sex work or prostitution by criminalising the sale of sex, criminalising clients. It was a point that I raised last week with the UN Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, that is not in fact what the bill does. Ireland is increasing the criminalisation of sex workers, so this speaks directly to the motion we're discussing this evening. If you read the statements and the speeches made about the bill, you would think that it's about criminalising clients. In fact, a client will be subject to a €500 fine under the new legislation. A sex worker found working indoors with another sex worker, which is defined as brothel keeping in Irish law, and something many sex workers do in order to make their working conditions safer by working with someone else, will be subject to a €5,000 fine or 12 months in prison. This is a doubling of the sentence that was there before, of a €2,500 fine and 6 months in jail. Again, just comparing the fines alone, never mind the prison sentence, this is 10 times the sentence that a client will receive with a €500 fine. So looking at it from the point of view of the sentences, this bill is about criminalising sex workers, not criminalising clients. The client element is a very minor part of Part 4 of the new bill, or new act rather now. Also, it's been regularly said that this is the introduction of the Swedish model, or the Nordic model as it's sometimes called, into Irish law, where clients of sex workers are criminalised. It's not at all, because the Swedish model at least involves decriminalising sex workers. This is more like something plucked from the Charles Haughey school of an Irish solution for an Irish problem, which worked out so well before. The government also ignored a huge amount of research that was done on the situation in Norway, Sweden and Canada where these laws exist. They did do some meta-analysis of legislation, meta-analysis of data from those countries, but it was a lot older than much more recent research that's come out in the last 2 years, particularly a study from HIV Ireland that found that sex workers would be discouraged from coming to sexual health services. In particular, the stigma around laws criminalising any aspect of sex work lead to people being discouraged from accessing health services. There's also a lot of evidence of sex workers being alienated from the police and from justice services because they were afraid of the increased surveillance that's involved with this type of law. There was research from The Lancet in 2015 that found that HIV infections between sex workers and clients would reduce by 33 to 46% over the next decade if sex work were completely decriminalised. There was a recommendation from the UN Health Rapporteur in 2010 that found criminalisation led to barriers to healthcare, This 2016 study from Amnesty International in Norway found increased dependence on third parties. Remember that the Swedish model is intended to reduce trafficking, but in fact, any laws criminalising consensual sex work are going to divert police resources away from criminalising trafficking and towards criminalising consensual sex work. Similarly, the Norwegian police, in a study from 2006-2014, found that trafficking numbers in Norway were stable. J. Levy study in 2015 found that the Swedish sex workers were being driven away from the police. Similar research in Canada found the same thing. There was also a 2015 study called Dangerous Liaisons by some researchers in Oslo, in 2012, that found increased HIV infections. What you particularly find with client criminalisation is that because clients are more nervous and more rushed, they're less willing to engage in the type of extended contact and extended dialogue that's necessarily for proper boundary settings, particularly around correct condom use. People are much more rushed. They tend to want to meet sex workers in a location that they control, in their apartment or house or hotel room. That's an environment that the sex worker doesn't control. It's a lot more dangerous for a sex worker. They're much more likely to be the victim of violence in that situation. Like I said, there's a 2008 piece of legislation dealing with trafficking, which is not being properly enforced at all. Also, you find that the hyperfixation on sex trafficking, while sex trafficking obviously needs to be dealt with, tends to divert resources away from dealing with labour trafficking. Some of you may have seen a piece a few months ago from The Guardian on labour exploitation in fishing industry in Donegal. It's terrible to me that that's coming out because of media research and investigative journalism rather than investigative police work. And The Gardaí are not devoting enough resources towards dealing with trafficking because they're devoting it towards kicking down the doors of what is defined in Irish law as brothels. This tends to be non-Irish, non-white people that get their door kicked down much more so than white and Irish sex workers. There's a huge amount of racial profiling goes into it. Also, migrant sex workers, if their brothel is raided, are much more likely to be, are susceptible to being deported as a result of that. You'll also find that the Gardaí will seize any money that they have and impound that. That's generally then given into the poor box and donated to organisations like Ruhama, which is the core of the Turn Off the Red Light campaign. It's important, I think, to note, it's not just a rhetorical point, but it is important to note that Ruhama is run by the same religious orders that ran the Magdalene laundries. And it's very much the same goal of rescuing so-called fallen women and rehabilitating them in some way from the corruption that they're involved in. I've often wanted to make some kind of, one of those sort of vintage style advert posters, kind of, I can't believe it's not butter type thing, saying, if you like Magdalene laundries, you'll love the Turn Off the Red Light campaign. Because the Magdalene laundries were, as far as I'm aware, the biggest piece of labour trafficking that ever took place in this country. And it was state-sponsored and state-sanctioned. What we have now around the world is a similar system where people are arrested during brothel raids and then trafficked into labour exploitation, where they're forced into government work programmes, not in Ireland as far as I'm aware, thank God, but in some countries, forced into work programmes in sweatshop labour type conditions. I also find it very hypocritical that many people who will support the Turn Off the Red Light campaign are a lot less aware of where the clothes that they're wearing came from and what kind of labour is used to produce them, or the food that they're eating. We are all complicit and we are all guilty in labour exploitation, but we don't seem to take that nearly as seriously. While sex trafficking is an enormous problem, we shouldn't disregard all other types of labour exploitation because we're over-fixating on one and diverting all the resources needed to tackle these issues into one area, particularly if they're being used to criminalise consensual sex workers. There's often the argument raised as well as, how can someone really consent to sex if they're being paid? Well, the new law that's been brought in does include a definition of consent, and nowhere in that does it say that if you're paid for sex, that does not count as consent. And also, there was a point brought up by one of the members of the UN committee last Wednesday, Patricia Schulz from Switzerland, who asked the representative of the Irish government, if a sex worker has a €5,000 fine or 12 months in prison, how does that help them exit sex work if that's what they want to do, if they have a criminal record or an enormous amount of debt? Also, how does it help a sex worker to be safer in her line of work if she is exposed to greater risk of HIV infection or physical assault, as has been shown by the evidence that I've cited? Like I said, the Irish government did not do they did not undertake any studies in Ireland before this bill was written. Any research that has been done was done after the fact and has not been done by the Irish state. We have had things like the HIV Ireland report. Also, the consultation with sex workers was terrible, and from my experience dealing on trans issues, I found an enormous amount of overlap where people believe that they know what's better for other groups of people who they perceive as vulnerable or fallen and not capable of making their own decisions. People are very willing to decide on behalf of other people what's good for them and disregard their bodily autonomy. So I would urge you to support the motion.
Let's call on you, Ms. Collins.
So I'm just going to start a timer so I know not to keep you guys too long. Well, it's nice to see Mark on the proposition side. A nice bit of optimism from him. I'm sure that he's going to talk about the free market, but I'd just like to point out, as Kevin well knows, that the price of Tinder is zero, because that's the supply and demand. Okay, so I'm going to talk a bit about why your body is not yours to sell. So I'm going to touch on a bit about organ donation and a bit about prostitution and sex work. But first, I just want to talk a bit more generally about bodies and why they're so important. Because bodies aren't assets, they're part of people. You can't disassociate the two, because your mind and your body are intertwined. We see this when people have phantom limb syndrome, like they can't disconnect the two things. Or when religions constantly, across all time and all geography, stress that your body is like a vessel for God, that you're made in God's image, that you need to bury, like you're dead, you need to bury the whole body so that you can get into Elysium or rise from the grave when Jesus comes back. Yeah.
But on what basis should we be following religion about what to do with our own bodies, given that even if it is connected to ourselves, we still have the choice to pass that on?
My point is that it's a very human thing. Religion, I don't think, doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes out of humanity. It comes out of our fundamental beliefs. And when there is this belief shared across time, across cultures, it is true. It must be true, because loads of different people have come to the same conclusion. And bodies are sacred in all cultures because they are our identity, because they are our humanity. And there are things that we shouldn't sell, and we should not sell humanity. That is just, we have life, and life is a gift, and it is priceless, and there are some things that should not be sold.
On that.
No, thank you. I think it's when we seek to dehumanize someone, we do this by cutting off their hair, by covering prisoners' faces, by attacking their genitals or their hands or their eyes, because that is their identity, that is their humanity. We see this when people desecrate graves of people they disagree with. They attack bodies because their body and their identity, their memories, their ideas are all intertwined. Okay.
What is it for you to say what someone is?
I'm saying it because this is a belief shared across cultures and time. It is a belief that loads of people have come to, and that is the only way I think we can find truth. And also, it's my opinion, it's my speech, I can give my opinion. Okay, so even the idea of having graves, of going and visiting a body, shows how important bodies are to us, how our identities, when you think of someone who's died, you think of their face, you think of their body, you think of their touch, their voice. This is all intertwined with our memories. So proposition can tell you that it's a choice to sell yourself. But I point out that no person is an island, that we all live in a culture, no one's in a vacuum, and how people perceive you, we don't perceive your mind, we perceive your face, your body, your voice, and that if you sell your
those things, you are selling your identity and how others perceive you. Because it is a fundamental part of humanity that our bodies are us. Bodies give us life. If we sell our bodies, we imply that life has a price, that life can be sold, that life isn't fundamental and sacred, which I think it is. Yes. No, thank you. Okay, so about organs. Just because something bad happens, like organ trafficking and that, doesn't mean that it should be legalized. That's why we have the whole idea of, criminal justice system and jail. And I think that you can point out, guys, I just want to talk for a bit, don't worry if you guys. So if you're willing to give up your identity, you're part of yourself, part of your body, you should do that because saving a life is just the right thing to do. You shouldn't do it because you're going to make monetary profit. It shouldn't be that you need to be incentivized to be a good person. You should just do it. And there should be organ donation, of course there should, but it shouldn't be selling and buying organs. Hannah Sophia was arguing that you're selling it and it doesn't harm anyone and it just will increase people's willingness to give organs. But that's not necessarily a good thing, and it does harm people because you're financially exploiting sick people. You're putting pressure on them to find money to buy an organ rather than saying, look, we have this randomized system that will give you an organ. And the way to solve that problem of not having enough organs is to develop technology. Like we have 3D printing. If people had just sold organs, we never would have come up with another way to do this. So it also creates a pressure on people to sell their organs. Say if you're in debt. There's this great musical called Repo, where it imagines a world where people do sell their organs. And if you don't pay off your debt, your organs are repossessed. It's a funny musical, but it's a horrible idea that you would put pressure on people who are sick or dying, and that their quality of life would suffer just because of their finances. We don't think that on this side of the house that organs are an asset. We think that they're identity, and you should encourage people to give them freely. If people need access to cash that you could get through selling organs, we should do this by increasing jobs or taxes rather than devaluing our identities, because the two are interlinked. And if you sell people's bodies or allow them to sell their own bodies, that is literally objectifying them. It is putting a price on them. It is saying, oh, that girl's worth more than that girl. And that's not a good thing to do. Ignoring the cultural,
Giving organs is such a good thing that people will do just voluntarily. How many kidneys do you have?
I have 2 because I'm saving them up. I think it is a good thing, and I have you all have our organ donor cards if you get a driver's license if you're in a car crash. I don't think it's that bad to say when I die I'll give my organs. I have no problem saying that. I just don't think I should sell them. I don't think I should profit from giving them. If I'm going to give it, it should be because it's the right thing to do. I'm going to speak quickly because I only have a minute. So, there is massive harm. There is the harm to the person selling of the whole cultural or religious or personal belief that what they're doing might be wrong. And no matter, you don't live in a vacuum. You can't say that, oh, we'll just make people not care about the stigma of sex work. It's still going to exist. And it's also a harm to the buyer to know that I am so unwanted that I have to pay someone to be with me physically. It's encouraging people to sell their organs. It's encouraging them to buy them. And that is encouraging them to accept that I will never find that, or that I have to pay someone, or that this is how unwilling that person is as the price goes up to be with me. And that's not a good message to send to people. So basically, just some food for thought about commercial surrogacy and renting a womb. There is this whole issue of consent. What happens if you are pregnant and the biological parents then decide they want you to have an abortion, or they decide that there is a medical procedure that you should have to undertake? Then you get into these complex issues of should it be the biological parent's decision or the body owner's decision? And when it is something that complicated and that much of a moral issue, I don't think that you should be doing it for money. You should be going in with the best intentions and the best relationship and trust with the people you're going into that agreement with. So I will listen to that bell and just think about, that is a really complicated issue, and it's not something that we should just make a profit issue. It should be a moral issue. Thank you.
Next call upon Mark Hennessy to propose.
118,000 people in the US, 61,000 people in the EU, and 55,000 people in Latin America. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to talk to you about what I believe to be the most impactful outcome of this motion, which is the market for organs, and extend on Hannah Sophia's points. Right? The figures you just heard are how many people are currently on a waiting list for an organ donation. That is, at present, over 200,000 people across 3 continents are currently waiting for an organ donation. On average, 22 people each day die in America while waiting for an organ donation. In addition, the average wait for a transplant of a kidney is 5 years. And that is 5 years of living a life on dialysis, 5 years of living a life of significantly less quality than it should be. If you think that that current figure of over 200,000 is a lot, then just wait for when when our #1 source of organs in the world is eliminated. Considering that 90% of US auto collisions are resulting from human error, and the impact of self-driving cars would be to massively reduce the number of car accidents on the road, while this is a good outcome, right, currently 1 in 5 organ donations come from a victim of a car accident. A significant reduction in the number of road deaths, such as the one presented by self-driving cars, would mean that this number would fall, and the problem of expansive waiting lists for organ donations would only get worse and worse. No, thank you. We are facing an epidemic here. Before I go on, I want to address some of the opposition's points. No, thank you. 15 seconds, Rory. Firstly, right, they tell you that only the rich will benefit and the poor will be harmed by this process, right? This is simply untrue. An implementation of a system into the general government-funded healthcare system could see the allocations of organs become much more efficient. Under the current system, allocation is based primarily on waiting time, luck, and who you know. In many cases, those who get organs are those who have the money to be able to seek out people with the same blood type as them and convince them to voluntarily donate their organs in return for a gift, right? Like a car, you know, like this actually does happen, right? Even more so, having a contact within the medical profession can result in you being moved up the waiting list over people who need it more, right? This new allocation system, right? A new allocation system based on the government intervention would allow the government to buy organs off people in the open market and provide them to those who need it most, right? Already under the NICE system, we see allocation based purely on utilitarian basis, in that the people who are most at risk of dying, the people who are at worst suffering, get the funding for what they need, right? This would mean that so many more poor people could access the system than at present, right? We provide so many, no thank you, we provide so many more health services to the poor than the opposition, right? Finally, right, this system would even pay for itself, because more organ donations mean more people returning to work, meaning more tax revenue for the government to contribute to healthcare costs. And secondly, the costs of long-term patients is gigantic, right? The costs of people waiting for kidney transplants alone is 6% of the Medicare budget in the US, and eliminating this cost would be huge, right? As for Eunice's speech, she essentially tells you, no thank you, that this will destroy the culture of our society, right? But what kind of society would we have if we base decisions merely on the basis of the current preservation of our culture?
On that point?
We would see a complete rejection of science, a complete rejection of progress based on any change which threatens our current way of life, regardless of whether or not that actually has inherent value. This is the same kind of soothsaying that is advocated by those who believe they can adjudicate on what we wear, what we eat, and what we do, right?
On that point.
In summary on Eunice's speech, the quote, "It's my opinion, it's my speech," seems quite valid. Sorry, Eunice, I don't believe your opinion should go over society's, right? So, now on to my first point, right? Market clearing, why a market for organs solves the current crisis, right? So the solution to any resource allocation problem in economics, where there is a divergence between supply and demand, is to implement You know what, Rory? You've been trying so hard. Go on.
Okay, so lovely bombastic rhetoric about not being letting people do with their bodies and so on. But
I didn't say anything.
So, but you and the other speaker said that you're not okay with somebody selling, for instance, their heart for a lot of money for their family. And I'm wondering, if you're as liberal as you say you are, why not?
Because that would cause adverse externalities in those people. I know for a fact that you actually know this, right? You're just asking hard questions, right? Like, the fact is, right, if everyone donates their heart, they die. Regulation isn't an inherently bad thing. We do support some regulation. Thanks, Rory, you know? Anyway, right, look, the solution... No. By providing a monetary incentive to provide organs, we would see the price given to the providers rise to where the supply of organs equals the demand, right? So obviously this has numerous benefits. Because firstly, the system implemented globally would result in all those 200,000 people on waiting lists receiving organs promptly, right? The place which has a legal market for organs, the one place in the world which has a legal market for organs is Iran, and no surprise, this is the one place in the world where no waiting list for organs exists, right? The elimination of those waiting lists would confer massive benefits, right? So firstly, in terms of the lives saved, but secondly, in terms of the lives improved. All those people who don't have to wait, and more to the point, who don't have to worry, who aren't subject to purely what the opposition gives you, which is, we don't believe that this should happen in our society, so we will not allow it, right? It's an entirely ridiculous premise to risk the lives of individuals versus actual composite benefits which we get from our side. Thank you very much.
Next, I can call on Hannah Bowman to actually oppose the motion.
Sorry for keeping you all waiting. For too long, women's bodies have been commodified by society. They have been controlled by those that think they know better. They are at the same time commodified and told they must display qualities such as fertility and virginity. We in Proposition think it is time for us to allow women to take ownership of their bodies and do with those bodies what they see fit. We think we should listen to sex workers, listen to surrogate mothers, listen to organ donors, and allow them to make their own decisions when it comes to those things. The reality of the situation is that capitalism coerces us all into working. So that's the problem I have with Hannah's speech when she says that the thing that is wrong with sex work, with organ donation, with that kind of thing, is that people wouldn't do it otherwise unless they were paid for it. The reality is, like, I wouldn't have a job working 40 hours a week if I wasn't paid for it. I'd go, like, relax by a swimming pool or a beach with that time instead. The people we're talking about in this debate, like, often do have no other option than to go into sex work, than to sell their organs, or that kind of thing. But the money they get from this allows them to genuinely improve their lives, and that's the comparative in this debate, because opposition seem to think that we can just, solve everything. We're like, oh, why don't we help people in other ways, and then it'll all be fine. Like, firstly, we can also help other people in other ways, and still allow them to do this. But also, notice that we generally, we just don't or can't. No, thank you. The government fails, a miraculously large amount of the time to actually help people. We think giving people the opportunity to help themselves is a much better way of seeing social mobility in the long term. I want to talk just about, no thank you, I just want to address a few more things that the opposition have said. So firstly, Hannah gets up here and she makes a funny joke about Mark not being able to change a light bulb, and we all laugh and it's pretty funny. But the reality is, on Hannah's side, she's the one waiting for people to donate organs. She's the one waiting for people to put food on the table for their kids. On her side of the debate, she is the one waiting around for people. On our side of the debate, when we give people ownership of their bodies, we allow them to change that light bulb in a way that opposition don't. And now also, I asked this point of information about me getting my appendix taken out, and Hannah says, well, it's okay because you were going to die anyway. So in that instance, I was able to weigh up the choice that I should get my appendix taken out because dying is better than having my appendix taken out. Other people can also weigh up the choice of, say, donating their kidneys in order to get money to put food on the table for their kids, or going into sex work in order to fund college, or anything like that. We think we give people that choice. No, thank you. So I'm going to talk mainly in this debate about coercion, and what coercion is, what it looks like, whether or not this is coercion, whether or not we are all just coerced anyway, and does that matter? So, on proposition, we believe that the kind of work we're talking about, with maybe the exception of organ donation, is principally no different from many other types of work. So you use your body as a waitress or as a receptionist, and that you have to always be smiling, have that friendly face that you show to customers. You use your body when you go do manual labour, often with very negative health consequences, as you might have. No, thank you. As you might have with organ donation. And in response to Rory's point of information, where he's like, "Oh, well, would you allow people to sell their heart? And if not, then people don't really have the choice." When we say we allow people to work, for example, that doesn't mean they can work an unlimited hours every week. That doesn't mean they can work if they're 15 years old. We have restrictions in place, but we still say that we allow people to work. In the same way, we in proposition can say we will allow people to sell their bodies, but yes, maybe there will be some restrictions on their heart. And the reason we do this is that people can use this money. They can weigh up that choice, that risk versus reward, and use this money, no thank you, to improve their lives. So in the event description for this debate, you might have read it, there are currently an estimated 4,000 students in Ireland who have sugar daddies. So that's often where often younger women are paired up with older men and essentially spend time and that kind of thing with them. Those are 4,000 college students, who without that money, without that income that they get from that, otherwise probably wouldn't be able to attend college. That income allows them to improve their lives, to go to college, to gain social mobility in a way that they otherwise would not be able to. Similarly, that woman who becomes a surrogate mother to feed her kids is now able to feed her kids when she otherwise wouldn't be able to. The same for the person who donates their organs, for example, and uses that money maybe to start a business or improve their lives in that way. And people do realize what they're doing when they enter into this kind of thing. No, thank you. People realize that their organs, might actually be valuable. They're not just their heart and the brain, but the other ones too. Apart from, I suppose, your appendix, which is literally just a ticking time bomb inside you. Women probably understand the risk of pregnancy. In the case of that woman who's doing it to put who's becoming a surrogate mother to put food on the table for her kids, as Maeve outlined, she's already got kids. She's gone through pregnancy before. She probably understands the risk of that and what that's like. She can weigh up that choice and if she should do this. And I'll take Hannah before I go.
So you're having to use the word probably, because even you admit that maybe she doesn't. And if she doesn't, we say we give you safety and security that you cannot give because you're stuck with the word probably.
Okay, I'm saying more likely than don't. If someone goes into manual labour, they probably understand the risks. I'm not going to say for certain they do. The same with any other type of work as well. I think it's fair for me to use that word. You can't win this debate on semantics alone. Okay, finally, let's talk about the black market. Because if opposition are right, and people do this, who are at the very bottom, have no other option in life, that means they're going to do this anyway. That means it is no longer like you going to a doctor to become a surrogate mother. It is you going to that shady guy that you know. If you were a sex worker, it is no longer you going through a legitimate business. It is you going to a criminal gang to do that. That is much more dangerous for 3 reasons. Firstly, you have much less information about what you are doing. So if opposition want to talk about coercion, there is much more coercion there because people do not know what they're getting into. Secondly, those criminal gangs are just going to be a lot more dangerous than some sort of business. They're more likely just to see you as disposable. And thirdly, you're not able to get help. If anything goes wrong for you, you are now a criminal too. If you are a sex worker, if you are someone who has become a surrogate mother, you are a criminal. You can no longer seek help if anything goes wrong. So for those reasons, I beg you to propose. Thank you.
I'd like to call on Rory O'Sullivan to oppose the motion.
Sorry,
You know, it's funny that for a team who were so free love and so interested in exposing bodies and selling bodies and so on, the proposition were very reluctant to reveal themselves fully to everybody. In the sense that they looked like at various points they were trying to argue for pragmatic things. They were trying to argue, well, we're the team who are cutting the bullshit, we're the team who are just about the best things for the most people, when they manifestly were not. And whenever they were questioned on it, they would fall back on what they actually believed and what they were actually arguing for, which was mere liberal nonsense ideology. So first of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about those benefits that they were talking about and why they're not true and why this debate is exclusively an ideological one. And then I'm not going to delude you. I'm going to talk about why my ideology is better. So first of all, we got some bizarre stuff about organ donation, which I was not expecting. It seems neither was the HIST, who had a guest speaker who was an expert on prostitution, but I see nobody with one kidney here tonight. But anyway, I don't understand why, if your only concern is the number of people who have organs, you don't just go for an opt-out system of donation like a few European countries who do so very effectively. We got one reason from the last speaker, no thank you. I mean, like 22 people die every day in the United States because they're on waiting lists we hear. I think far more people die in the United States, full stop. Those people's organs could be given over. We were told by Mark, well, Google cars, they're coming in. They're not coming in for a while, Like, I think in 2056, we can have this discussion again and then see. But until then, I don't think we need to worry. Also then, we were told that it leads to a decrease in live donations by the first speaker because people don't like the government. I think, look, I mean, there are still plenty of dead donations, which I think would be fine. But also, as one of our speakers pointed out, when you allow people to sell organs, you're going to get far less donations of organs, because why would you donate your kidney when you can sell your kidney just as easily and get a lot of money for it? So, again, that argument is nothing to do with saving people or not. If you're concerned about saving people, you can do it on our side of the house. If you're concerned about the employment of 4,000 people in college, as Ronan McYulla-Rua is, then you can just find them jobs in D2. I don't know why they need to go on sugar daddy websites in order to do so. No, thank you. For many other people, in terms of what our guest was talking about, so all of these issues, it's interesting that the studies that were cited, that they didn't mention anything to do with the places where prostitution are legal, in which there are many other studies that would show that it leads to things like an increase in trafficking, an increase in STDs, no thank you, less safety for sex workers, that it generally distorts people's self-perception around sex, and as Carole Pateman argues, it reinforces many patriarchal perceptions. It is a lie to say that, no thank you, in general, sex workers support the legalization of the consumption of sex. Many do not, no thank you. So, again, those things are far from clear. You can talk about it until the cows come home, and none of us have any clue anyway about what those things are, because we're not experts in the field. But the only thing I want to flag with this is that our sole expert in the field is not representative of the entire field. There's a whole field out there. No thank you. Flowers and so on. So, no thank you. So, to think about this issue in terms of, cut the ideology, we only want to talk about outcomes, is completely misleading from their side and shouldn't be countenanced. No, thank you. Why is our ideology the best one? Well, look, one of the things that we need to recognise is that bodies are important things. One reason for this is that there is no difference between one's body and yourself. Maybe you believe in the soul. The soul is a philosophically improvable and therefore irrelevant concept for our purposes. And so, no thank you. And so that distinction between yourself and the self that is doing things is one answer to the distinction between your body and mining, which is in the point of information. Your time, your labour, these are not things that you imbue with your sense of self, nor are they the self that does the imbuing. No, thank you. We know bodies are special because our most intimate interactions are often associated with them. We lock our bathroom doors. No, thank you. We don't lock the door when we go mining. We categorise sexual assault as a discrete crime because we understand that the significance of our bodies in those interactions are specifically and particularly important. And those things aren't always rational. I mean, all four of us now at this stage have tried and failed to eloquently argue for why the body is so important, because it's not one of those things, no thank you, that you can always just explain, in the same way that not all things about the human condition and experiences can be explained. Some things are about vulnerability and about our inner selves, not the intellectual selves that go debating and mining and driving Google cars. And we have to respect those things in debates as well, even if they are harder to talk about. Okay, there were four of you.
Roy, if my body and my mind are so important, can you explain to me why you're making my decisions here?
Absolutely, I can. I absolutely can. No, I can. Because decisions don't happen in isolation. In fact, all of our decisions together produce culture. Culture being the cumulative series of interactions between individuals and the impact on what we all do and how we view ourselves and the people around us. The liberals, like you, Ruth, want to view that interaction in a specific context, in the theoretical, abstract context. And their weakness in this debate is about talking about situations in that theoretical isolation. In theory, if one person gave another person a kidney and there was nothing else in the universe, that would be okay. In the actual world, where legalizing those things, having laws around things, the way that we treat those things shapes our own self-perceptions and perceptions of others, it is far more complicated than a simple question on information. What will this do? It will separate people into two groups, the privileged and the vulnerable, and create structures around those different groups. I did think at different points in this debate that maybe members of the proposition had gotten ahead of themselves and donated their ears because they didn't listen to some of the things that our speakers said, in particular to do with how organ donation will skew, so that the majority of people who wind up donating organs will be poor and the majority of people who buy them will be rich. How prostitution tends to skew, where the people who are doing the buying tend to be men and the people who are selling tend to have more feminized bodies. There's a structural fetishization of the female body in our society which contributes to the prostitution. Footnote, Pateman. You give one group the entitlement or ownership over the other on their side of the house. You solidify those divides. And because the body is so central to people, you create a world where that control that one group has over the other is totalized. Where not only is it in your external world, but it's in your internal world. It's behind the door when you lock yourself into a room. It's in every interaction you have, and it's in your very mind. We don't want that. We want a world where some things, at least, can be yours and don't belong to the liberals we beg to oppose.
I will now put the question to the House on the motion. This House believes your body is yours to sell. All those in favour? Aye. All those against? Nay.
I think the ayes have it.
I think the nays have
Yes. You think ayes? The motion is carried. Now, as the chair, I believe I can make a few comments. I haven't actually been, it's interesting, I suppose, been interested in work in surrogacy in women's rights for a number of years. It's interesting. I didn't expect, but did anticipate something on organ donation. So I think one of the issues that's interesting when we're talking about bodies is how the issues that are pertinent change. And in Ireland, we are now coping with prostitution, and the arguments presented around the table tonight relate somewhat to that, and of course the issue of surrogacy, which is also on the radar, but still a bit ignored in Ireland. I think I just make a few points. I mean, the first point I would make is, I think that it's important to distinguish between the body and bodily related services, because I think most of the philosophical approaches have made that sort of distinction. And I think they're sort of useful in terms of doing the analysis. As you know, prostitution in Ireland is not illegal in the same sense, but paying a prostitute for sex has been criminalised. Surrogacy in Ireland has neither been regulated nor legalised, so it has remained in a very strange limbo. And the issue has come up very much in terms of what to do when we consider a mother who gives birth as the mother, the legal mother, and her husband the legal father if she's married. So this has arisen in the courts with handling birth certificates from people who go abroad for surrogacy. So these are, in one sense, real issues that we have to address. I think on the fibre, they're everyday lives and we can't just ignore them. I think that the approach taken by philosophers is very different to the approach taken by sociologists. And I think what is interesting in terms of the way philosophers take it, they argue in a very, very abstract way. And I think one of the most interesting books I looked at recently in the light of this debate, which I was only asked to chair a day or two ago, just as well as to do, but it's a book by a woman professor of philosophy at Oxford, who's written a book on whose body is it anyway. And she outlines very clearly, because a lot of you mentioned liberalism in the proposals particularly, and you'd be rather comforted to find she agrees with a lot of the proposals in her outline. So she, as an egalitarian liberal who believes that people should be supported, she argues really that we have to respect each individual's agency, autonomy, that that's part of human flourishing. So accordingly, she says that people, including women, should be free to decide what to do with their bodies. In particular, in particular, they should be free to provide and sell sexual services. Now, the basis on which she does that is interesting. It does support the sex workers' union report, but she actually wants to distinguish between your body and a particular service that you sell, so that you retain, she claims, your bodily integrity while selling in that kind of case. So it's an interesting distinction, I think, for those who are interested in this. Now, in terms of surrogacy, she takes a slightly different tack, because she actually says that, again, she wants to say that being a surrogate is not to be accused of selling a baby, that you can't commoditize a baby, and commodification is a lot of the meticulous debates that I'm not trying to go into, but she claims that if a commodity is something is sold, it can be abused, or, you know, it really is a form of negative commodification. And she says, again, that women who become surrogates do not commodify and do not sell a baby. Instead, she says, and she used the language, she deploys her reproductive capacities for 9 months, iron out hard to herself. So she again introduces this distinction between the two features of a woman's life, her general well-being and her ability to hire herself out and be, as most people said, very well served by it. So she that was her, you know, her big defence of it, and it's a very interesting book in terms of defending the liberal position, and I think any of you are interested in following it up more might go to that as a source. Now, I was very taken by her and almost totally convinced by her and all her arguments, actually, reading the book, and the fact that she was French and, you know, a woman, she was explicitly a feminist, she didn't mention Aikman very much, though, but, so I thought this is fine, but I'll go further. But one of the other interesting things she says as a liberal, and I think this is kind of interesting given the English Anglo, you know, influence that often Ireland is under, is she does say very specifically that she has a basic axiom, and that axiom is that one has the moral right not to be interfered with when harming oneself. I found this, as a mother-grandmother, actually a bit strange, because it actually says that a lot of her arguments really depend on that. So you are allowed to base yourself in private, which is often the treatment, for instance, and the position of homosexuality written in private and presented, but not out in public or for people in general. So she says this is something she believes in, whereas I wondered really whether everybody, given, and I worked in social work and social policy, the idea that we shouldn't interfere with people when they're harming themselves somehow went against the grain for me, because we spend a lot of time trying to stop people from harming themselves. Having said that, I mean, I did agree with the notion that criminalising acts can make often neutral acts worse for that person and make them more vulnerable, as indeed many of the debaters have set tonight, and, you know, in that way hinder them gaining self-respect. Now, when we go in, and I only looked at 2 types of activities because I'm old-fashioned, and the 2 things that were spoken about for years and years and years were prostitution and, in latter days, so I just addressed those just more specifically. Now, the thing about it, you might have to ask, well, is, you know, sexual intercourse, and again, I mean, sexuality has become so much more exciting nowadays, so I will not be going into the varieties and forms, because it, again, would be the whole big, longer session. But in terms of the formal, old-fashioned, dare I say, prostitution, when, you know, the people, apparently the women in the beyond the bank there had a house of repute to serve parliamentarians, most of them all of whom were male, and to service their needs. It was very seen as a form of sexual intercourse to satisfy male needs, and that certainly is still the long tradition of it. Even though we now have sexual intercourse in terms of part of married life, essential, and in romantic love based on desire. So sometimes it's maybe difficult to think, well, there's nothing wrong then with selling sexual intercourse if that's what you're going to do, which is a service. And if the client appreciates suddenly lots of money for it, well, why not? And certainly criminalising it may make matters much worse. Now, and in particular, sex workers do say that the debasement in sexual intercourse as a service or a provision of service is because the legal makes it degrading, not the nature of the work itself. And we've had elements of that, I think, reported tonight. Now, the second one then is surrogacy. This is slightly different. I think it's actually quite different from prostitution. And this is something mothers have done for years, usually in marriage and love, under duress. They get pregnant, sometimes positively, environment, and sometimes negatively. Surrogacy in general, even in the case of the Indian women, who many would explain are severely exploited, and others would say they are not, because many of them do it to buy a house after 2 pregnancies, because it is very thing. But it has to be planned and invoked at least one other partner, or people, And I also suspect that when we have artificial wombs, which I think are probably on place, and even a whole lot done artificially, as some really radical feminists were told, well then surrogacy will probably not there will not be a need for surrogacy. But I think surrogacy is very much in view with altruistic reasons, as well as actually, in many cases, being monetized. So I think, again, Celine Faber does actually overcome a lot of the negative aspects of surrogacy by taking on board its seriousness through the claim that many people, the motion said, should be rewarded in terms of proper contracts. Now, they're the kind of philosophical approaches, which are often kind of clear-cut and interesting just to maybe plot out. But the international social science literature is far less decisive, and I think if you acknowledge the differences that often obtain between feminists on many of these issues. And when we're looking also, and I would look more at the political context and the social context of legal change, and having less philosophy, I suppose, to become a sociologist, it would be inevitable that I would give a little bit more credence to the sociological matters rather than, while still maintaining respect for the philosophical point. And one of the things that I think has changed the nature of the debate in prostitution, and it's very interesting, I encourage many of you to read these, they're from very good accounts of prostitution in Sweden and in Holland, who had very different, really, ways of dealing with prostitution. And in Holland, for instance, they insisted that everybody was a sex worker, protected, and all the rest of it. And that went on very well for a while until all the sex workers were trafficked, and many of them came into other countries, and they found they were excluded by the dominant resident prostitutes, and created a greater problem then for the others. So this raised and fused, I think other people mentioned this tonight, this fused, I think, the question of prostitution and trafficking. And that seems to have very definitely changed the debate, particularly in my lifetime and my analysis. Whereas I would have had intuitively said, well, in the earlier days of feminism, that selling a sexual service is fine and okay, and really people are a lot fuddy-duddy about it. But it's interesting when you read the debate, in particular when you read the debate on Sweden and the changes over time, they have very much moved on with the taking on board, I think, trafficking, taking on board exploitation, taking on board children as prostitutes, which has been very, when you see reports of very young people from Thailand, I think the enormity and the risks of prostitution have become interpreted in a very different way. And interestingly, in terms of the law in Sweden, the Nordic model, which they brought about the criminalisation of sex in terms of prostitution as a gendered issue, largely in the context of violence against women initiative. And I think the feeling was, and I must say I am a bit more, I am certainly converted to that more, and than I would have been, is that they found that in society, and Sweden has done most to liberalise women in terms of equal status, equal opportunity, sharing childcare, share. Fathers, for instance, were biological fathers in Sweden long before we had the DNA test. So Sweden have a very particular history, and they also have a totally different history as a democratic state to England, which I think is also interesting to look at. Because in Sweden, certainly, they do boss people around, they do interfere, and they get things done. So you don't have the same autonomy, even though you have a very developed social democratic system that actually serves people and looks after people and does all the things we like to see done, and the more the things we like to see done. So I think the Swedish, what they did in their law was criminal. And the reason they did it really was that they thought it was best seen as violence because of the social conditions that obtained that made women, particularly younger women, extremely vulnerable. And in that reason they thought that they need to have new legislation on it to actually change the status of women and to respect women, bring about a greater respect for women. In all aspects of their life, as distinct from, isolating the sexual services that they do. So in that sense, I think they did bring about greater autonomy for women of a different kind. And there would seem to me too, when I was thinking further about it, that payment to an extent is fine, but there is a slight hint that payment has a sense of giving more willingly and with entitlement, which may have a slightly negative effect on the position of women in societies which are still extremely unequal in terms of the distribution of jobs and work and all sorts of things between men and women. So I think in that sense, I think there is, I would to some extent welcome the support in the recent Irish bill, even though I have huge reservations about it and difficulties with it. However, the funny thing is that when I'm thinking of surrogacy, I don't have the same reservations at all about surrogacy. I think surrogacy, unlike prostitution, is a very public thing. Women proclaim it rather more widely than sex work, than anybody who runs prostitution. I think it's an interim need, and I think for many women who are willing to do it, given bringing children about and the role it plays, is actually something that I would support in terms of it. That might be very confident with my comments on that.
So I'd like to thank you all again for coming to the debate. In particular, I'd like to thank our two guest speakers for coming and sharing their thoughts with us this evening. So I think with a round of applause. Even though Reading Week is next week and you all have time off college, we're a bit nerdy in this. So we are doing a debate that week, and we decided, if we're nerds, why not just go all out? So the debate is Harry Potter themed. So the debate next Wednesday evening is This House is Hufflepuff and Proud. Unlike our debates that take place here in the chamber, it will be upstairs in our conversation room. It will be much more relaxed. It's a great way to try out debating if you want, and it will be, fun in inverted commas, because is debating ever really fun? We have two debating competitions running this term. We have Harney's, named after our first female author, Mary Harney. It's a competition for those who identify as female or non-binary. It's on this Thursday. This week's round is on tomorrow at 1 o'clock. And while the rounds most weeks are prepared, and that you get the motion about a week in advance, the motion tomorrow is what we call BP. So the motion is given to you 15 minutes before you have to speak. So yeah, that's, if you want to try out debating, that's a really good way to do it, because there's no audience or anything like that. So it's a great way to try it out. And the final of that competition will be taking place in the chamber in week 8, I think it is. And you have to do maybe 2 or 3 rounds or so in order to be eligible to go to the final. So I'd really recommend trying that out. And the other competition, which I'd also obviously recommend you trying out, is Tones, named after one of our other auditors, Wolf Tone. That competition is open to everyone, and that competition, all the rounds for that are BP style. So for all those rounds, the motion is given to you 15 minutes before the debate. And I promise that's not as daunting as it sounds. There's rounds for that every week. Again, you'll have to do 2 or 3 rounds in order to be eligible to go to the final. And the next round for that is Friday at 3 p.m. Both Harney's and Tones take place in our conversation room. You can find all the details about those competitions on Facebook as well. Our next guest coming up is Sarah Koenig. She's a journalist. She's host of This American Life and the Serial podcast. And she's going to be coming on the 6th of March, which is the Monday after Reading Week. So watch out on Facebook for that. And also sign up for the UCD Pro-Am and the Maynooth Open online, so you can find those on our Facebook group as well. We have a lovely reception upstairs for all of you, so I really encourage all of you to go upstairs. And finally, before we go, I'd just like to point your attention again to the oratory returns, which you'll find in your seat. As I said, this out of debate, these are really important to our speakers, including me, so I'd be really grateful if you could fill those out, please. And thank you. I'll now hand you back over to our chair to adjourn the meeting.
This meeting is adjourned.